It's amazing to see all of you here. It's wonderful. Thank you for coming. As you know, my most recent incarnation, I have worked since 2000 as a founding member of the Good Neighbor Steering Committee, which is still going strong, to be a watchdog of the refinery. I have participated on commenting on the DEIR that was done in 2003 for the VIP Valero Improvement Project that continues until it will be completed in 2015. And I won't go into any of those details, but I can tell you that last year we learned that the Natural Resources Defense Council had already been checking into Valero's proposal for a crude by rail project. And I was notified of this and was extremely surprised, grateful, and all those feelings that one has, because we haven't had that kind of help before. And just when we were planning a forum to be able to allow Natural Resources Defense Council to present their information and the research they had gathered from some very reputable people whom we knew about, Lake Megantic happened. Our forum, when we heard about Lake Megantic, we were absolutely sobered and shocked because we were going to face, we thought, this very same problem here, or the potential for it, which was absolutely unacceptable. But you can imagine how fired up we were when we had our first forum last July 9th, only 3 days after Lake Megantic, and 2 days before the Planning Commission hearing, in which our city was going to tell us that they recommended a negative declaration on impacts and that we would, in fact, have smooth sailing for Valero to continue with their project. But the voluminous amount of comments submitted to the city on that cursory environmental review set the planners back, and they did finally require a full environmental impact report that we're now waiting for. Approximately 8 months since last July, they had said the DER, that's a draft environmental impact report, would be out by October or November at the latest last year, and we haven't seen it yet. We thought we were going to get it at the beginning of March. Looks like they've had a lot to consider, many obstacles thinking about how to present this project now, since there have been 5 major derailments, catastrophic derailments involving Bakken crude coming from North Dakota. I want to say that I hope you all take the brochure, that I will actually take credit and be responsible for the facts in it. If I've gotten anything wrong, I would hope to correct it at a later point. But as far as I can see, these are basic facts that we would hope the public becomes aware of, and you can use to stimulate your own questions about this project and write to the city and to the Planning Commission your thoughts in anticipation of the DEIR. And certainly we're hoping you'll get engaged with that. Oh my goodness, I have 2 minutes. The 2 most important issues to consider are not just that this crude would be arriving by rail, tar sands and Bakken crude. You can read about both, and you'll hear about these things from other people on the panel. But it's not only that it will be arriving by rail, but it will also be processed here, and there are many dangers associated to its processing for human health and public safety. I want to remind you that Valero is the largest, 4th largest American oil company in the United States. It is not one of the majors with its own oil fields, so we know that they would go out on the open market looking for what they call advantagely priced crude oil, and that happens to be, since 2010, known to be Bakken crude out of North Dakota and tar sands out of Alberta, Canada. They have mostly kept silent about what they're doing. They've hoped that this project would fly by. They're very disturbed. Wall Street investors are wondering what's going on. We required an EIR. But we can call these crudes that they want to bring in extreme crudes. I'm not shy about that. And the main thing that Valero's CEO wants to do is bring it in because it's cheap. It's cheaper. It's discounted by the Canadian government. The tar sands are discounted heavily with agreement from the majors to give advantage to the oil majors. And we know that Bakken, we now know the U.S. Transportation Safety Board has said that Bakken crude is a very dangerous crude. They're trying to do stricter regulations for rail transport, but they won't be into effect and enforced by the time we get that draft EIR in our hands, and our Planning Commission is going to vote on it. So you have to think about what they mean, what Valero means by oh, it's only a simple logistics operation. It is not. And I believe that the evidence is there. The evidence is there to make sure that this project doesn't go forward, and we're counting on you to help us make sure of that. Thank you.
You know, out in the industrial park, Valero kind of dominates. When we think of the industrial park, we think of Valero. But actually, there are 600 businesses out there. So how does this project affect those businesses? Well, tonight we have a gentleman that wants to talk about that. In fact, last year, when a train derailed right in front of his business and shut it down, they told him, get used to it. Well, this is Ed Russell, and he has a family business, the Russell Woodworks, and he would like to give you a perspective of what can happen to the other businesses and in the industrial park that will be affected by this project.
Thank you, folks. It's quite a pleasure to see you here. I'm honored to be able to give you a bit of my information from my perspective at the industrial park. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. It's basically a slideshow, so I'm going to sit here. I do have a laser pen, so I want to be able to highlight a couple things for you. We got a lot of stuff to cover here, and what I was hoping to cover for you is just to give you the lay of the land here, so you kind of understand some of the hidden areas where rail comes into the industrial park, who some of the users are currently, what kind of traffic impacts we have, and some of the logistics issues, and also what Union Pacific's been doing as they describe as a maintenance project here in the park. So this is my facility right here, a World War II building. We own this little triangle of property right in here. The mainline tracks are right along here. Bayshore Road's coming up this way, and crosses underneath the interstate. And here's the off-ramp. And here's my facility. This is my building here. This is 4:30 one afternoon. People are ready to go home, and we have about a 20-unit or a 20-car train coming by. Every day they bring in about 15 to 20 boxcars a day of beer. So we have 15 or 20 cars going in, 15 or 20 cars going empty. You got to do something with the bottles, right? And then back here are some petroleum tank cars. Most likely they are for asphalt, being empties going in or coming out. Okay? So a small train like this, only about 15 or 20 cars, might block the traffic because it's going quite slow. It's shunting in and out often. It might block traffic for 10 or 15 minutes. This is what we see on a daily basis. So what we have here is a drawing that came from the 60s. This was what the Army left us. This is their inventory of the industrial park that we now reside in. My little property is right down in this area here. The blue lines are the mainline railroad tracks, and for the most part, these orange lines here, or yellow, that's the infrastructure that the Army left us with. And we're going to look at these again soon. So we could see it was a pretty sophisticated bunch of loops, a very large storage area to handle trains. This is where they handled and unloaded a bunch of bombs. And this area here is where Valero is right now. On this little spur here, that's where they load out their pet coke. There's a couple interesting things to note here, is that was these loops that we see in here that allowed the trains to circulate, and this little Y connector that allowed trains to move up here and then back into this upper park area. This is what I'm going to call the industrial way siding area. Thank you. So here again, just another train movement happens every day. We get used to it. It's kind of fun checking out the graffiti. And here's about a 15 or 12 car hopper cars. This is pet coke cars. They come in and out of the refinery daily. They typically take about 10 or 12 of these a day. And here's what the working tracks look like now. You'll notice that the loops have been removed. Valero's in this area over here. And other users in the park, the big users, are up here. This is Stone Road area. That's where the beer goes into. And then down in this area in here along Industrial, we have two users. One for steel up here. They bring in maybe half a dozen cars a week. And then industrial gases, I believe CO2 comes out, maybe a couple cars a day. This is Valero's product terminal here where they put in their, or they take out their propane. And this is the spur that goes up to their coke loading facility. And then in here is where their asphalt plant loads out some cars. And then the trackage goes down here and continues down to the bridge, which would be way down here. So here's the Park Road crossing. This is one of their engines. This is a local switch engine. It's only 4 axles, and it's moving these small local cars up and down the trackage. This is, again, it happens several times a day. This is in this area. Oh, I'm sorry. This is right here. And this is the Y area where it goes up to the pet coke and then up into the loading facilities for propane. The other thing I'd like to show you here is that everything comes up this one track. It moves through the yard of Valero, and then it pops back out here on the short little length of Bayshore Road. It goes through another gate, and then it comes up to their large storage areas here in the Upper Park. So again, another short delay here on Park Road. We've been told in the draft as far as traffic mitigation that because it's an industrial park, we're used to delays, so that this new delay for these crude oil trains will not be an additional impact. Okay. So this is where the cars are exiting Valero, moving up to the northern end of the industrial park. So here's, again, a small train. We got to bring our beer in every day, or maybe those are the empties going out. And this is kind of the far end of the park. This is along Stone Road. What we have here is about a dozen hopper cars. They're probably for pet coke. They're probably owned by Valero, but nobody says. Sometimes they're owned by the railroad. Sometimes they're owned by the customer. Sometimes they're owned by a leasing company. And behind it is the warehouse, and so there's another row of tracks we don't see, and that's where they distribute the beer from. So these cars are just sitting on the siding because we have a parking problem. The rails have a parking problem, and so they put cars where they can. Now we're moved back down to the park. This is right parallel to industrial. This is what I'll call the industrial, or the Oregon Street crossing area. The UP owns 3 sets of tracks in here. They're approximately 3,000 feet long, 2,500, 3,000 feet long. A unit train is going to be 4,000 feet long. 4,000 feet is the length of Main Street here in town, or First Street. Thank you. Okay, this is the far end of the industrial park. This is what they call Goodyear Road area. It's by the compost yard along 680, if you know it. This is the only area where they have a major sidings that can accommodate unit train size cars. And next, please. And a unit train is a car or a train made up of all the same product or commodities. In this case, it's automobiles, and this siding here is occupied almost all week long by trains coming and going into the Amports facility. Amports currently is the biggest user of rail into the industrial park, and they have no intention of letting somebody else's crude cars interfere with their rail traffic. So this is a unit train, so typically they're going to be 50, 70, 100 cars long. Now this is on Industrial Way. We have some local media out here taking a look at what's going on out here. This is from last September. You can notice down here a very large section of tracks being ready to be pushed out into the, to replace existing trackage. Here again is a view of hopper cars, and in the background, this is the major siding area that the railroad has in the industrial park, in this north end of the industrial park. You can see the large tracks that they're getting ready to put in here. There's about 5 or 6 long tracks here, about 3,000 feet long, thank you. And you notice how close the public can get. The cars would be right here. That's okay. And you could walk right up, you could walk right between those trains. And then, of course, down here is the lower port area of the park. So you can see the silos in the background, the construction crews there, and the railroads have improved the tracks for about another 2,000 feet to the right. So what we're seeing here is that same shot, but in this case, the purple is where all the construction has gone on, and we'll see a little bit more of that. So you'll notice they didn't put any new construction up here where they send the beer, but they did improve this crossing where there hasn't been traffic in decades. Okay? They haven't done any work in Valero yet because that's on private property. That'll be Valero. So now we're starting to see heavy construction. This is last summer, a bunch of long rail coming in. They say they replaced like 5 minutes of rail. Thank you. Bunch of construction on industrial. We could just keep rolling through here. This is along Industrial Way. This is along Industrial Way. They're going to complete a whole bunch more traffic or connections in here. We got to watch for that because this is where the crude by rail projects go. And this area here is as close to the houses as on Valero's property. More construction. Here's some more tracks going to go in on Oregon Street. Thank you. Here's the Oregon Street tracks going in place. They're getting ready. Keep it rolling. We don't have much time. Thanks, Kat. Here's my property. So main line here, up above. Here's the spur that will take the unit trains down into the industrial park. They'll go all the way to the bridge before they could back them up across this trackage past my property and into the industrial, or into Valero. Here's the tracks they're putting in. Keep rolling, Kat. This is class 1 stuff. Keep going. I think they call it like 138, 140-pound rail. This is as good as it gets. No complaints with them. And thank you very much. I would just like to say that what we're seeing here is a great improvement in the structure of the rails, but no increase in the security or the circulation here. So everything will still have to come up and down this one same corridor. And if you could maybe go to the very last one that shows what Valero's doing. Little pet Coke spill. This is there's my brand new driveway they put in for me. This is right at my driveway. This was a minor pet Coke spill. It wasn't a big pile, but it dragged all down the tracks all the way to the silos. And this one was significant enough that somebody came and washed it down with water. So here, this is coal getting loaded out. Those are unit trains of coal going into Richmond. And here's what Valero tells us all they're doing. This is where they're saying their impact is, and a little bit of impact here on Park Road. And I thank you very much.
Our next speaker is someone who I have admired from afar. I've watched her on Democracy Now! I've read her books. I've paid to go see her speak. And wouldn't you know, I can't believe it, she's sitting in my library. In my hometown library. And we are so honored and privileged to have her. Antonia Juhas. She is an expert oil industry analyst. The last book that I read was Black Tide. It was the real story of the BP spill in the Gulf. Please read it. You can't put it down, and it'll make you cry. Antonia, thank you so much for coming. I can't believe that you're here. It's just incredible.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry. Extremely kind introduction. How is the sound? Better. I want to encourage the people who are outside to come on in. We've got some room, and we want to make sure you can see. So thank you all so much for being here. My name is Antonia Juhas, and as you heard, I'm an oil industry analyst. I'm also an investigative journalist. I write articles for places like the Contra Costa Times to the New York Times. I have a new piece on CNN.com that just ran on Friday. I write books. I have just a couple here. The Tyranny of Oil would be useful for you all. Breakdowns of the oil industry, and then Black Tide on the Gulf oil spill, also useful for you all. And I'm going to spend my time giving you basically a breakdown of this oil that Valero would like to bring to your community and why the transport of it is deeply problematic. And just to put in the basics, what Valero wants to do is bring in about a train that carries 100 cars. So we were looking at trains that carry about 10 or 15 cars, right? So these are trains that would carry 100 cars, one of those a day, at least, every single day, 7 days a week, carrying new forms of crude into your community to be refined in your community. And guess what? The main type of oil that we know for sure they want to bring is the same type of oil that blew up the downtown and killed 47 people of Lac Mégantic, Quebec, which opened up our presentation today. So I'm going to do a quick PowerPoint presentation for you to hopefully put all this in context. So this just starting here. So the proposal is to have a lot more crude moving by rail through your town. Why that might be of concern. So the first thing is trains derail. You're familiar with that because they derail here. Here's a recent derailment. My notes aren't there. That's all right.
That was November this year, right on Park.
November
Yep.
November 6th.
But I'm going to need them for the rest of them, so I'm going to give you a set, Kat. Yes. Brilliant. All right. November 4th, 2013. Okay, next one. All right, so go back. Sorry. All right, so then now I'm just going through, preparing for this presentation, looking at crude by rail derailments that are happening as I'm preparing. So this is not me pulling together the best and the brightest. This is as they're unfolding as I'm preparing for this talk. February 13th, crude by rail derailment in Pennsylvania, 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of crude oil spilled. This one, New Augusta, Mississippi, January 31st, train carrying oil and other hazardous chemicals derails. Next. January 20th, sorry for that arrow, but if you can see this, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a crude oil rail train derails on a bridge over a river. That's a bridge, that's water underneath, that's the train derailed. We're still just at January 20th. Next one. This is New Brunswick, Canada. I didn't really look very much in Canada. This one is on here because it's very near to the border of the United States with Maine. I could have had a lot more derailments if I also included more in Canada. But this one, 19 cars derail, catch fire, 50 homes evacuated, January 7th. Next one. This is Aliceville, Alabama, November 8th. This is the worst modern crude rail transport derailment because 750,000 gallons of North Dakota Bakken crude spilled from a 90-car train, setting off a series of explosions, and this is a wetlands area, and this is what's left of the train. Next one. So also, there is a very strong chance that tar sand oil from Canada could be brought in. So this is, if you see all that black goop, this is what a tar sand oil train derailment looks like. This is Parks Prairie, Minnesota, March 27th, 2013, 30,000 gallons of crude released when this train derailed. Next one. I think we have a video, a little bit of video for this.
It's like the bombings in Europe.
I think that's good. Probably go back to the slide. So that one, that's Castleton, North Dakota, Bakken crude oil, a train derailment on January 1st, 2013. So this was 480,000 gallons of crude spilled. Now, the important thing to note, this was 1 mile outside of the heart of the town. So this was obviously very almost a lac magnétique right here in North Dakota. The 2,400 residents of the town were forced to evacuate for days. And like lac magnétique, and again, over and over again, we see this oil is so intensely flammable and combustible and burns so hot. And the local communities have absolutely no training. The local firefighters have no training. The oil companies haven't set up special training. They don't know how to deal with the fire. So what do? They let it burn for days and days and days because it's too dangerous. Now that's just not a fire burning, that's an oil fire burning, releasing all of its toxic chemicals into the air for days and days and days and days. Next. All right, so what's going on here? You've been in a community that's had oil moving out of it for a very long time. Why are we suddenly seeing this type of thing happen? So the first is there is significantly more crude being spilled by rail. If you look at this chart, those are years on the bottom and amount of crude going up the top. It starts in 1975. If you look at the amount of crude spilled from 1975 going up to 2013, that's the bottom. 2013 is the end. That line up top is the amount of crude oil spilled by rail in 2013. Now, I'm born in 1970. This is my entire lifetime, just about, right? And in 1 year, more oil was spilled by crude, that's last year, by rail, than in all the other years combined. Something has changed. Next slide. So why is this happening? The first answer is that we are producing and moving a lot more oil by rail. The oil that's being moved, the most that's being moved by rail, is this Bakken crude from North Dakota. We're producing more of it. It's more flammable. It's more dangerous. And the third answer is it's not being regulated. So what's going on? The short answer is that in the language of the oil industry, the age of what they call easy oil, and I put that in quotation marks, is over. The oil that they could get from their perspective easily, more cheaply, lighter oil, easier to refine, that stuff is mostly gone. Now, of course, if you're a community that's ever lived where oil is explored for, or produced, or transported, or refined, or sold, you know there's no such thing as easy oil. But what is left is in places that had previously been deemed too sensitive, too important, too technologically difficult, too expensive to get to, and places that it didn't seem to be worth their while for a lot of reasons. Well, now they have to go after that stuff. What that means is delving deeper and deeper and deeper into the ocean. It means pulling oil out of tar to get it just a teeny bit of oil. It means fighting wars for countries that don't want to give over their oil. It means going into some of the world's last, most sensitive rainforests. And it means trying to get a little bit of oil out of shale rock. So how many of you have heard of fracking for natural gas? How many of you have heard of fracking for oil? Not as many. So this is the same technique. Oh, you're doing the time, sorry. This is the same technique used to get natural gas, but they're using it for oil. And you have to use a ton of chemicals, you have to blast through rocks, you have to use water to get a little bit of oil out of shale rock. One of the places, most important places where this type of technique is being used to get at oil is in North Dakota. And one of the reasons why we're starting to see more of it being gone after is there's at least two reasons. One is that the oil industry was very successful in getting the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to change its rules to let it start booking as reserves this very difficult oil to get at. That change, and I can go into it more in questions if you want, but it's important just to throw it out there, brought in the big guns, the big oil companies, the Exxons, the Chevrons, the BPs, the Shells, to start investing in this shale product, oil. And they developed a new technique to go after it called horizontal drilling. And this oil, this getting after this type of oil has exploded in one place in particular, North Dakota, where they're getting tons and tons more oil using this frack technique. The problem is it's not your regular old oil, this fracked oil from North Dakota. So next slide. So they're producing dramatically more of this oil out of North Dakota. That's what that statistic is. Moving North Dakota to become, after Texas, the state producing the most oil on land of any state in the United States. North Dakota wasn't even on the map, to being number 2. And they have to move it somehow. North Dakota didn't have a lot of oil, so there aren't refineries there, and so they have to move it somehow out of North Dakota to places where there were refineries. And the fastest way to move it is by train. Now that's only part of the answer, though, of why so much more is moving, and that's that other statistic. The other reason why so much more is moving out of North Dakota, and this is really important, so when people say to you, you don't want them to bring more oil here, if they bring more oil here, they'll refine more here, and then they'll sell more gas here, and then your gas prices will go down. Doesn't everybody want their gas prices to go down? Well, yeah. But while we've had this oil boom, have your gas prices gone down? No, in fact, they've gone up. The reason why is because they're producing more here, and then they're exporting it out of the country so that they can sell it in places where they make more money. Because from the oil industry's perspective, the price of oil and the price of gas in particular is way too low, particularly in the United States. They're not making nearly enough money off of gas, and they really want to try and get the price up. So one of the ways they do that is by reducing supply, right? So they're producing more here, but they're also exporting more out of the United States. So next slide. Okay, this is just to point out that we export a ton of product of our refined gasoline out of the Bay Area. In fact, we export more out than any other metro area in the United States. So just because someone's bringing more stuff here absolutely has nothing to do with the idea that your prices will go down here. Next one. Okay, why is this stuff so dangerous? Basically this stuff isn't really, it's not really appropriate to call it crude. It's more like a sort of gasoline, the stuff coming out of North Dakota. It's very volatile and flammable. And this is a chart of just how volatile it is. The North Dakota crude that's going to be moving through here is the top of the list. That's volatility. The rest of these are the oils you're more familiar with. They're much less volatile. Next one. Okay, why is this problematic? Oh boy, I'm definitely out of time. It's not being regulated. So we've had a boom in the transport of oil. It's more dangerous oil, but nobody's regulating it. So here's what the National Transportation Board just said. Oil spill response planning requirements for rail transportation and oil petroleum products are practically non-existent compared with other modes of transport. So they have basically no requirement that Valero or the city or anyone has to prepare for an accident here. So you've got exploding trains, more of them exploding, and no one has to prepare for anything to go wrong here. That's problematic. Next one. The National Transportation Safety Board believes that because conditions have significantly changed with the recent massive growth in crude oil transportation, the regulations are no longer sufficient to mitigate the risks of petroleum product releases in accidents. They can't regulate it. They're telling you, we're not regulating it yet. We can't keep you safe. Therefore, next one, the National Transportation Safety Board says, where feasible, require rerouting to avoid transportation of such hazardous materials through populated and other sensitive areas. Don't run these trains through communities, says the National Transportation Safety Board. Pretty simple, don't run them through communities. Next one. Just in case you think that moving tar sand oil or other products by pipeline is the way to go. Okay, pipelines, first of all, in the United States, are very old. Most of them are 40 years old. And they're not prepared for any of this stuff for sure. But therefore, if you think the answer is we need, well, so here's an old pipeline, first of all. Here's an old pipeline that burst carrying tar sand oil, an Exxon pipeline in a neighborhood in Arkansas. This is the result of a tar sand oil pipeline oil spill. This is someone's backyard. This area is still contaminated. This was April of last year. But new pipelines being built in Canada to carry the same stuff. Brand new ones are bursting even more than they're bursting here because they simply aren't and can't build them safe enough to carry to deal with the volatility of this type of oil, which requires acids essentially to make it so that it can move through pipe. And guess what the acid does? It eats the pipe. And that's not even talking about this Bakken crude, which is more flammable and more volatile, and I don't even want to think about moving that stuff through pipelines. Trains are scary enough. Okay. I think I have just one last slide, and my time's up. However, there is an answer. We don't need this stuff. We really don't. So the United Nations has said, and the climate experts of the world have agreed, that in order to avert the worst of climate catastrophe, we have to leave at least 3/4 of existing fossil fuels in the ground. So if we want to save our climate, and if we want to have healthier choices for our communities, and we want to avoid moving this last remnants of what's left of their products around, we just have to choose to leave it in the ground, not have it move through here, not produce it, not move it, and come up with much healthier alternatives. And Los Angeles just voted, the city council voted unanimously, to ban all fracking in Los Angeles. So they're banning it at the root, and we can ban it at the transport. Thank you very much, and I'll answer your questions at the end.
Now, Valero isn't the only refinery that has plans to ship in crude by rail. Actually, we think all 5 of them are planning to do that. So multiply all of this by 5, and you have a major mess on your hands in the Bay Area. And Andre is here tonight to give you a little idea how all of this is linked together.
So to try to put some context around all of this, first of all, I've spent almost my entire life in the city of Richmond. I just moved here to Benicia last May, but my mother had lived here, since like the 1980s, and my father had lived here as well. So I'm not unfamiliar with Benicia, but it was quite a surprise when I got here, and I work for Communities for a Better Environment. I'm the Richmond organizer, so we're on the front lines and have been on the front lines for 30 years in Richmond dealing with refinery-related issues, whether it's emissions, whether it's monitoring, the whole plethora of issues that are involved. But then I found out that Valero was trying to do this crude by rail with a mitigated negative declaration. And I used to be on the Richmond Planning Commission until I moved up here. And what I was astounded. I said, oh, how could they even think about that? But somebody thought about it. Somebody in the planning department said, well, we'll go with your thoughts. And that's what was put in front of the Planning Commission. Well, fortunately, because of people like Marilyn and Jan and others, Roger, who have really been working here in this community for many years, they were able to fill the council chambers with Benicians, and the Planning Commission clearly got the message that that was not the way to go. And so that kind of action by the people are what the people who are going to make the decisions are going to need to hear. In Richmond, we were so frustrated with basically 90 years of corporate domination that over the last 10 years, we have been working at the grassroots level, running candidates for city council, because it's not just about Chevron. It's about a perspective, it's about a worldview, it's about a political view, that if you think what the big oil companies are telling you is the truth and you're willing to go down that path, then either you don't have critical thinking or you're corrupt. And that's what we had to deal with in Richmond, was that. And so we decided to get rid of the corruption. And so we've been running candidates, and it's touched on a whole range of issues. And I say that because what we've discovered is that in the community of Rodeo, Crockett, where they have the Phillips 66 project, once again, government did not serve the community well. The puppet advisory committees they have there did not serve the community well. And when the people finally found out what Phillips 66 was really up to and the risks that that posed to their community, now some of them are here. Say hi, Nancy. And then similarly, right around the same time, people in Pittsburgh started finding out about something called Westpac. And they didn't know whether it was west, like out west, or whether it was west, like West Parker, or Fest Parker. But they just, they didn't know what it was, never heard about it. And when they found out that they were talking about bringing in this Bakken crude and the tar sands literally behind people's houses, behind parks, behind schools, in what used to be a PG&E power plant, they got, righteously upset. And so they started organizing. So what's going on in all these communities is organizing, reaching out neighbor to neighbor, and more importantly, now we're reaching out to each other. We have Liana Monterrey and George Monterrey from Pittsburgh over here who've been. And so to give you a picture of what's happened, was they were trying to do the same thing in Pittsburgh that they were doing out here, trying to ram it through real quiet and real nice. And but then the community stood up. They got over 2,500 signatures within a couple of months, and that can sway an election in Pittsburgh. So guess what happened? The Pittsburgh City Council got the wisdom, and they decided to recirculate the EIR to deal with some of the questions that were raised by the community members. It also helped that the same concerns were put into a letter by the Attorney General Kamala Harris. So that kind of got them the religion over there. And then in Contra Costa County, because it's the County Board of Supervisors, not the City Council, that makes the decisions about the Phillips 66 project, it went to the Planning Commission, which was stacked with building trades members, as well as the guy who used to be the plant manager for Phillips 66. He is currently a Contra Costa Planning Commission. He had to recuse himself, but the rest of it was stacked, unanimous vote. They approved the EIR. So our organization, Communities for a Better Environment, as well as the Rodeo Crockett Citizens.
Crockett Rodeo United to Defend the Environment, otherwise known as CRUDE, Crude.
That's right. Very creative out there as well. So they got together and appealed to the County Board of Supervisors, and even though they shut down the refinery and packed it with over 150 refinery workers, to our about 40 people we had there, who testified, of course, they were screaming jobs, and we were saying public health and safety. The County Board of Supervisors chose to extend their hearing until, I believe it's April 1st, to do more analysis, and the Kamala Harris letter also helped. So what's happening is there's a movement, a groundswell of people just like yourselves in all these communities, neighbors who don't want to see Lac Megantic happen in their backyards. And so the key to all of this is the big oil companies have big money. They buy governments. They own governments. But here in our communities, we have a chance to stand up. And because our democracy is close, it's person to person. The mayor is here this evening, hopefully expanding her education as well. And hopefully you saw the op-ed Elizabeth Patterson had in the Chronicle, what was it, last week? Yeah, so raising concerns and questions about this that are going to be critical in the decision-making process. Now, the EIR, all EIRs are generally done by consultants paid for by industry but hired by the local governments. And so that's supposed to give the appearance of neutrality. But almost every consultant who writes these EIRs at one point used to work for the industry. So they're never really going to put in negative commentary. They're going to try to frame everything the way the industry wants it. But one of the things that's really been powerful here in Benicia is because of all these disasters, the evidence is clear. This stuff is too dangerous for anybody's community. And not just Benicia, but the whole Bay Area. Now, a couple other things that are tying us together is that the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is planning a regional emissions rule. And once again, the Air District staff is caving to industry pressure. And so we, as a community, as people, have to put pressure on the elected board members who hire the staff and say, look, if your staff is not doing our will, then you need to get rid of your staff and get some people who will reflect the needs of the community here in the Bay Area. And then finally, one of the things that Lac-Mégantic has finally shined the light on, that it's not just Benicia or Martinez or Pittsburgh or Rodeo or Richmond. Because this stuff is coming on rail, everybody on the pathway is at risk. And you're going to hear from Damien from Davis, because they're right up the road. But think about Sassoon Marsh. You know, what happens if those tar sands fall in there? This stuff will be there for years. It's so thick, they can't get it out. Lac-Mégantic, we learned from Marilyn Savat, was that they are rebuilding the rail tracks so they can run the trains through, even though the land is so contaminated they can't rebuild the downtown. So they're going to relocate the people and force their neighbors to have to move so that these people can be moved in. Think about that as a future for this community. I don't think that's the kind of vision that the people of Benicia have, and I think that when people get educated about this, finally they're going to say, stop crude by rail. Thank you.
Our next speaker is our guardian angel. And I say that because she gave us the heads up about what was happening at Valero. And we're very, very grateful to her. She's a scientist. She studies not only the safety, but what really I like about it is she studies the long-term health risks. You know, it's one thing for things to come in by rail, and that's dangerous enough because they can explode. But what are the impacts to our children and our long-term health living in a refinery town? And she's going to talk about that tonight. Diane from the Natural Resources Defense Council Fund. Sorry, I knew I was going.
I have to confess that when we first heard about the Valero Crude by Rail project at NRDC, we honestly didn't know what to make of this project. But we smelled something a little funny, a little off. We were concerned. And next slide. You know, this did not seem like your standard little innocent choo-choo train project. So my kids really like that train, by the way. We hired some experts to look into this project and tell us what is really going on. What are they trying to do here? Is this no big deal or something to really get concerned about? And I've learned a lot in the process. Our experts told us that in all likelihood, you know, the Valero didn't really disclose what kind of crude oil they were going to bring in with this project. There wasn't a whole lot of information in that first project proposal. And our experts told us, in all likelihood, they're going to be bringing in Bakken crude oil, this fracked, highly volatile crude oil in the near term. But in the longer term, all of the oil markets look like this is an effort to bring in the very dirtiest of the dirty and dangerous crude oil, that's tar sands. And I want to talk to you guys about the health impacts of tar sands tonight. Tar sands has health impacts from the second you try to mine it, strip mine it, or drill from it up in Canada. All through the transport process, it's highly, highly corrosive. And then, of course, when you start to try to refine this very thick, gloppy, I think is the scientific term, gloppy oil. It's dangerous stuff. Next slide. So here's a picture of the tar sands. Kind of looks like coffee grounds a little bit. Some people say it's got the consistency of peanut butter. Please don't eat it. Extremely toxic. It's contaminated with a lot of heavy metals and other pollutants. And I'm going to walk you through some of the health hazards of this. Next slide. So one of the problems with tar sands is that it's incredibly difficult to refine, and it's also hard to move because it's semi-solid. So what do they do after they take it out of the ground and take the sand out of it? They put a lot of chemicals in, solvents in there to make it flow like regular oil. And those solvents carry pretty serious toxic hazard by themselves. They release things like benzene, which is a cancer-causing chemical associated most with childhood leukemia. And then the other problem with tar sands is the very, very heavy bottoms. It acts like refinery bottoms, and it takes a lot of energy to refine this stuff. Next slide. So we compared, looking at a US EPA database of refinery emissions across the nation, we compared what the emissions look like from the very heaviest crude oils, the refineries that are currently using those heaviest, very dirtiest oils with the national average. And the heaviest crude oils in the first column, and you can see a whole host of really toxic, kind of notoriously toxic heavy metals: arsenic, cadmium, chromium, lead, manganese, mercury, and nickel. And of course we threw up sulfur on there too, because heavier oils like tar sands are contaminated with a lot of sulfur. When you compare them to the national average, which is the first column, and then when you weight it, the national average for throughput, so how much these refineries are actually producing, you can see that for a pollutant like arsenic, you've got 4 times the amount of arsenic coming out of refineries that process the dirtiest crude relative to the national average. And look at lead. You've got 5 times the lead emissions when you start to process heavier crude. This raises an enormous red flag for us. We can't look at this data and say, this is what's going to happen at Valero if they start processing tar sands. Each refinery is unique. But again, it's a red flag. And environmental groups and health groups worked very hard decades ago to take lead out of gasoline and out of our fuel. And I think we need to ask ourselves, do we want to be processing these fuels that are laden with the toxic heavy metals and go back to high lead emissions? Next slide. There's a whole host of other serious health impacts. Well, I didn't tell you what the health impacts of lead are. So lead is a notorious neurotoxin. It causes serious developmental delays, IQ loss, behavioral problems, including violent behaviors. And some experts associate lead emissions with an uptick in violence throughout the nation. There's a host of other health impacts from the types of pollutants that refineries release, and we expect these to increase significantly with the introduction of much heavier crudes like tar sands. So what are these health impacts? We're talking about increased levels of soot and smog-forming pollutants, and those are associated with cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, premature births, other birth defects, premature deaths across the general population, and of course respiratory illness like asthma. Next slide. So another problem when you start to transport and refine tar sands is the odor problems. Tar sands have very high sulfur compounds, but there's one in particular that we're really concerned about, and that's called mercaptans. That's a class of compounds that is highly odoriferous. It just means that it's really smelly. And you guys might have heard of mercaptans because it's actually added on purpose to natural gas so that you can detect a leak. So that's for safety reasons in very, very small amounts, tiny amounts. The problem with tar sands is that it's present in much larger amounts, and that makes people really sick. Another problem with mercaptans is it's extremely flammable, and so that makes it even more hazardous from a handling perspective. Next slide. So another problem with refining tar sands is that you get a lot of this byproduct called petroleum coke. And you guys are already familiar with petroleum coke because Valero here in Benicia does produce petroleum coke. The problem is when you start to refine these heavier crude oils like tar sands, you get vast quantities of petroleum coke. And refineries in the Midwest that have transitioned over to tar sands have experienced that, and a lot of suffering in those communities from those petroleum cokes blowing around. These photos were taken in Detroit next to the Marathon refinery there, where they had huge piles just sitting there blowing around in the open air, and people live right next door to that. It's also a problem on the south side of Chicago. And I also included a picture of the derailment of the pet coke train here in Benicia, just as a reminder that this stuff is messy. It's all over the place, and it's already kind of a problem here in Benicia, but that problem would be expanded greatly if we start to have these dirtier, denser crude oils. Next slide. So Antonia covered this really well, but I just want to note that this is the fact that the tar sands and these unconventional extreme crude oils are related to increased accidents. Part of the reason for that is because they're incredibly corrosive. They have very high total acid numbers in addition to being very volatile like the Bakken crudes. And so that puts our aging refinery infrastructure really at risk, where we're already having problems with leaks and accidents in our refineries. Here in Benicia, I think we've been a lot more fortunate than some of the other Bay Area refineries. Nevertheless, it puts us at increased risk that these older refineries were not built to handle these much more corrosive fuels. Next slide. We're also sitting right next to the very ecologically sensitive Sassoon Marsh, which feeds into the San Francisco Bay. And we're concerned that with increased accidents from these crude by rail facilities and from the refining of dirtier crude oil, that we might get a lot more spills into our bay. And by the way, this is a picture from Michigan of a tar sands pipeline spill that happened 3 years ago, back in 2010, I think. And it's a $1 billion cleanup job, and they're still cleaning it up today. They're not finished. So this stuff is incredibly hard to clean up. Tar sands is really dense, and it sinks in water. It's almost impossible to clean up. Next slide. I'm wrapping up here, Roger. So one thing that we're always really concerned about, and particularly here in Benicia, but also with these other Bay Area crude by rail and refinery proposals, we're really concerned about residential proximity. Putting children at risk, putting families and communities at risk, with schools so close by to these facilities, they really don't belong here. These are heavy industrial operations, and there are residents living really close by. And that's not a good mix. Next slide. I just want to remind folks where some of these dirtiest crude oils are coming from, because people live there too. So this shows where the tar sands region of Canada is. It's in a province called Alberta, so way far up north. We're seeing tremendous impacts from tar sands extraction and also upgrading. It's sort of pre-refining up there. There have been snow and stream water samples done downstream of these development sites that have shown off the charts pollutant levels. Next slide. And these are making people really sick. And I'll just note that I brought a bunch of handouts detailing the health impacts of tar sands from extraction all the way through transportation and refining. They're on the table. If we run out, you can contact me and I'll get you more. And they detail some of these health effects. We note a greatly elevated cancer incidence in these regions that are downstream, and many other health impacts listed there. Next slide. So I think folks really need to stop and question, is this a good fit for Benicia? Do we want to bring the world's dirtiest crude oils here to Benicia? Do we want to bring all the health and safety risks of the rail transport here in Benicia and risk these accidents? Is it worth it? Next slide. And I just want to ask everyone to think about all of the victims of Lac-Mégantic and step up and say no to crude by rail here in Benicia and say no to tar sands. We don't need that kind of safety risk here. Thank you.
You know, it's really woken up a lot of people up.
Is Damian Luzo. He's from the city of Davis, University of California, my alma mater. We're very proud to have him here. The city of Davis is already mobilized and energetic because those darn trains are moving right through their downtown. If you've ever been on Amtrak, you go through the cute little town of Davis. Well, guess what? They don't want it. And we're going to support them for not getting it. So Damien is here tonight. He is, as young as he is the CEO of Save with Sunlight Incorporated. That's the direction that our town needs to go, right? Yeah. In our industrial park, that's the direction that we need to go. Of course, Davis is very so enlightened about all of these things, and we welcome you, and we're really anxious to have you here and hear what you have to say.
Rail 2 at a city council meeting last month, we had 50 people on really short notice show up to a city council meeting, and everybody came up and gave the same accounts that you've heard here today, and all of these concerns. Lynn gave a slideshow which was pretty powerful, and we're wondering, like, what can we do? And the only thing that UpRail communities can do is make comments, give recommendations. We don't really have jurisdiction. And, it really comes down to what your planning commission decides they're going to do with this. They are the ultimate decider in this project. So the more pressure you put on them, and, trust me, we're here to help you guys with putting pressure on them, but it's the pressure that we're able to put on them that is ultimately going to decide whether these projects move forward. And we have a really good city council. Dan Wolk, city council member, he's already sent a letter to the town of Benicia, and we've got everybody there basically on our side. We're a very environmentally friendly, a very environmentally conscious city, but we're just as worried about everyone along these lines. And our recommendation is we're going to go to Dixon, we're going to go to Fairfield, we're going to go to Vallejo, we're going to go to West Sacramento, and we're going to get everybody involved with this so that everybody UpRail is supporting everybody here, and we're just hoping for the same thing in return. So let's put some real pressure on them.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Go to Richmond.